Good afternoon, colleagues. I welcome you to a seminar, which I'm sure will be interesting. A seminar by Dr. Mahabub Hossain. We videotape it. Please come in, there are all sorts of seats. We videotape the session, and because we know internationally Mahabub is considered a development leader, and there's a big audience out there who would like to listen to him and his always new ideas. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Mahabub Hossain to you. He's a Bangladeshi national. He studied in Bangladesh and in Calcutta, and he did his PhD at the University of Cambridge in the UK. His research focused on development economics issues, mostly in South and East Asia, South and Southeast Asia. Topics which Mahabub has changed the perspective on include agrarian structure and land reform, rural non-farm activities, finance, microfinance, credit, infrastructure, and he always was and is concerned about poverty distribution and equity issues. For quite some years, Mahabub was leading the economics department of the International Rice Research Institute. As Executive Director of BRAC, the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee or Commission, one actually doesn't use anything else but BRAC. BRAC is something like Coke. You don't spell it out. Taste. BRAC has become one of the largest NGOs in the world, the largest Southern-based NGO, not only active in Asia but also in East Africa. It's a global player, focused on poverty reduction, on innovation, has a university, has a bank. It's a very innovative place, and Mahabub Hossain played an important role in making it what it is today. One of the role models for innovative civil society-rooted organizations. Mahabub, you are incoming president of the Asian Agricultural Economics Association. The international gossip community has put you, I meant to say media, has put you among the 500 most powerful people in the world a few years ago, and that's where you belong. You are a man, soft-spoken, willing to take hard decisions, with an open mind and a big heart for the poor. I'm grateful that you are here. Please speak to us. You are here for a workshop which is listed here, Water, Sanitation and Health. We have a busy workshop next door on nexus issues, connecting things which typically are not connected but ought to be connected, such as people's well-being in the context of water systems, public health systems, hygiene, and how agriculture and irrigation interferes with that. Complicated agenda. That's why you are here to share your wisdom next door, but now we would like to listen to your lecture. Let's welcome Dr. Mahabub.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Van Braun, for that very generous introduction. I would consider myself as a researcher. Actually, I have been doing research on agriculture and rural development issues for a long time. But I had the opportunity of leading this what we now call development organization. It started as an NGO in Bangladesh. So that gave me an opportunity to apply some of my knowledge that I learned from research into the practice. As I said, that I am knowledgeable about agriculture and rural development issues, but not on health, sanitation, and water, obviously as part of agriculture, but not water as part of the health and sanitation issues. But I had opportunity to watch, because BRAC was engaged in development intervention in those areas, so I learned something from there. I'd like to again thank Professor Van Braun for inviting me to come to this workshop, because what is new here is the word nexus, how we link or how these different sort of areas are linked. Is there any synergy or sort of negative or positive effects of those areas? These are exploring new knowledge, and I think you are giving leadership to generation of that new knowledge. I can see the research that has been embarked by the Center for Development Research is breaking new ground in some areas. So with those few words, let me start my my presentation. I would have four sort of areas. The first, to give you information about agricultural growth and how it affected the water resources there, because as you know that agriculture is the largest user of water in the world, and more so in Bangladesh. Then I will say a few words about the situation of poverty and nutrition, because we are always sort of concerned about poor people in some of those areas. Maybe the issues are general for all households, but in some areas, obviously, the concern is for the relatively weaker sections of the society. So we'll see in Bangladesh what is the situation on poverty and nutrition now, and whether in the development interventions we should go for a targeted approach or a universal approach for all households. Then I would give you a few information based on nationally representative surveys, mostly done by the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics, on the incidence and change in the situation of water, sanitation and health. And finally, I'll go into the BRAC's interventions on some of those areas. And there has been some studies of its impact, so I'll give you a brief on that. So on agriculture production and its pressure on availability of water resources, if you look at the structural transformation in Bangladesh economy, independence Bangladesh was predominantly agriculture, accounting for roughly about 2/3 of the GDP. That was 4 decades ago. During the first 2 decades after our independence, that is in the 1970s and 80s, the economy was growing at just less than 4%. The population grew at about 2.5%. So there was not much change in the economy. The per capita income was growing at less than 1.5%. But since 1990, the economy has been doing very well. The economic growth was 5% in the 1990s on average, and 6% per year in the last 1 decade. And there has been tremendous progress in population control. Now the population growth is estimated at 1.2% per year. So the per capita income is growing at around 4.5%, and we can see the impact of that in terms of economic progress and well-being of the people. The agriculture share has declined tremendously. As I mentioned, from 62% at independence, now it is only 18% of the GDP, and this is the usual development story, because the other sectors, particularly industry and service sector, grows much faster than agriculture. So with economic progress, the agriculture share in the overall economy declines. So nothing exception. This is the general development trajectory that we have seen for other countries. In the agriculture, actually, the crop and horticulture sector is the dominant sector of the agricultural economy. It was 2 decades ago, about 70% of the agricultural output came from the crop and horticulture activities. It has now come down to about 56% because the agriculture is also getting diversified. So some of the non-agricultural subsectors have been growing fast, and we see particularly fisheries have been growing very fast over the last two decades. If you look at the overall sort of GDP growth and agriculture as well as its subsector growth, you can see that agriculture has done fairly well. Over the last 2 decades, the growth has been about 3.7% per year. And this is considered to be a very high rate of growth of agriculture if you look at the development history of other countries. As usual, among different sectors of the economy, the crop sector has grown at a slower rate, but still about 3.1%. And this is usually the case because the income elasticity of demand for crops is usually less. These are basically inelastic products. But as incomes grow, people go for a more diversified diet and want to have more sort of meat and fish and vegetables in their diet. So we see that pattern, and the economy, particularly the agriculture subsectors, have been growing in response to that demand growth in agriculture. The fastest growing sector in recent years has been both livestock and fisheries. Like crops, fisheries is other sector which is basically related with water resources. And I'll mention in my, I'll show some numbers showing you how both the crop sector as well as the fisheries sector is putting pressure on the water resources in the country. So among the crop sector, rice is the major crop. Nearly more than 60% of the value of production comes from rice. You can look at the other crops, it's very insignificant compared to rice. So it's basically a rice-dependent agricultural economy in Bangladesh, and you know that the rice is a heavy user of water. So that's the link that you see with the growth in food security through rice and the pressure on water resources. We grow rice in all 3 seasons. So there are 3 crops that come up during the year from rice. And as you see from this figure, that most of the growth in production of rice came from dry season Bodo rice. This is the fully irrigated rice crop. We have 2 other rice crops. One is pre-monsoon rice, we call it Aus, and the other is the monsoon rice, we call it Aman. But if you look at that, the progress in these rain-fed crops have been slow. So it's mostly the irrigated sort of rice crop that contributed to increase in production. If you look at the numbers, in the 1990s, the Boro rice, which is the dry season irrigated rice, contributed 91% of the additional rice production. And from 2000 to 2013, about 72% of the additional production came from rice. So the country is on the verge of achieving food security, particularly rice security, rice self-sufficiency, and it has been achieved at the expense of heavy exploitation of water resources for growing rice, particularly groundwater resources. These have been the driver for rice production in the country. If you look, this is the expansion of irrigation. So there has been very fast increase in irrigated area. It was only about, at the time of independence, only about 15% of the rice area was irrigated. Now about 75% of the area is irrigated. This is the growth of Bodo rice production. And this line shows the modern irrigation. Irrigation by tube wells and power pumps. If I had drawn the sort of area under power pumps, that was relatively flat. Most of the expansion in irrigation has come from deep tube well sort of irrigation, particularly small scale shallow tube wells. So it's exploitation of the groundwater resources that contributed to the growth in rice production in the country. The other area, the other sort of economic activity that is dependent heavily on water is obviously the fisheries. Bangladesh has a vast floodplain of 2.8 million hectare out of 14.4 million hectare of land mass in the country. It is a vast fisheries resource, but the yield has been very low. So we have not been able to exploit that resources much for fish production. The potential remains unutilized due to problems associated with the use of common property resources, because these floodplains during the dry season, those are individually owned. People go for Boro rice cultivation, but during the monsoon season, the land remains underwater from 4 to 6 months. There are opportunities for fish cultivation there, but because of the issue that since the water is there everywhere, the individuals cannot invest on fisheries. So it's a culture fishery, it's a capture fishery that is being practiced there, and the yield is very low. If you look at the floodplains, the yield is only about 270 kg per hectare. In Cambodia and Vietnam, the yield now is approaching about 1 ton, so our yield is very low. But most of the expansion that has happened is in pond aquaculture, where the yield is about 2.8 tons per hectare. There's been rapid sort of growth of pond aquaculture, and that happens by converting the deep water rice land, because the country had about 3 million hectares of deep water rice land, and that land is now being gradually converted into fish ponds, and the entrepreneurs are going for fish cultivation in those areas. The story is, you can see from here, the pond aquaculture, which accounted for only 15% of the fish production at the time of independence, it now accounts for half of the fish production. And if you look at marine fisheries, the contribution has been going down, as well as fisheries from rivers and canals. So at the beginning, there was about 50% of the fish production came from those two sources, but in more recent years, it's only about 27%. So it's the pond aquaculture which is growing very fast, and it also puts pressure on the water resources. One is that many of the wetlands are now being converted into fish ponds. That's one thing, and the fish is intensive fish culture with lot of use of chemicals and others. It's also polluting the environment. So you can look at the impact of those, particularly this one shows the underground sort of aquifer, and if you look at in recent years, the aquifer has been going down. So this is creating an environmental problem, and the availability of drinking water because of the aquifer going down from the extraction of water for rice cultivation. So this is one sort of negative picture that you see. These are for the northwestern part of the country, not for entire Bangladesh. This is a recent study that has been done by BRAC, looking at the impact of irrigated rice cultivation on availability of water resources. The second one is on the wetlands in the country, and you see in different northern districts the trend in availability of wetland, and you see quite a negative sort of growth in the availability of wetlands. As I have mentioned, that some of the wetlands have been converted into fish cultivation, but the others are being filled up and are used for growing Boro rice or used for habitation. So this is another development that is worrisome for the country. So that gives you a broader picture of agriculture and how it puts pressure on the water resources. But if we now look at the situation on poverty and nutrition, Bangladesh has made good progress on poverty reduction. we have the, you know that the Millennium Development Goal, the first Millennium Development Goal is on poverty, to sort of reduce poverty by half using 1990 as the benchmark. At 1990, we had about 57% of the people who are poor. The latest survey that the government has done, the government statistical organization, is 2010. It shows that the poverty rate has come down to 31.5%. So we are very close to achieving the Millennium Development Goal targets. We need to sort of reduce it to about 28–29%. And we see that recently the poverty rate has been going down at 1.7% per year. So many people estimate that we have now already sort of crossed the target that we are supposed to sort of achieve. And the other point I would like to mention, that if you look at both moderate poverty as well as extreme poverty, there has been progress in both areas, particularly over the last 10 years, from 2000 to 2002. There has been reduction in both sort of moderate, general poverty level as well as the extreme poverty. And this has happened both at the national level as well as in rural areas. So this is a very good sort of information for the country. So who are the poor people? Actually, there has been some analysis there, and we see that the incidence of poverty is very high for the landless households with illiterate members who are basically engaged in manual occupations such as agricultural laborers, construction workers, and transport operators. So the poverty is concentrated in those groups. So it's basically lack of land and lack of education, which are the major sort of causes of poverty. The incidence of poverty is low for medium and large landowning households who have better endowment of land, capital, and educated family members. So education particularly is very important for reduction of poverty. The other aspects is the nutritional aspects, and this story is also good in that if you look at this, the major sort of measure of malnutrition is the stunting, and the stunting level has declined from about 69% in 1985–86 to about 41% in 2011. There are some studies have been done in 2013 which shows that it has come down to about 38% now. So, and the progress has been quite rapid over the last 2.5 decades from there. But the wasting level is very high. People usually say that if the wasting level is over 17%, it shows very acute kind of malnutrition. This is the measure of current sort of malnutrition levels. The underweight, which combines those two, we have made quite significant progress. I would like to mention that this progress has been much faster than made in India. There's a talk about the disconnect between economic and agricultural growth and progress in malnutrition in India. In Bangladesh, that is there, but much less. So with economic progress, we made quite a bit of progress in reducing malnutrition. But the issue is that still the number is unacceptably high. It's higher than many African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, which have less income than Bangladesh. So the nutrition is a serious concern for the country. If you look at the link of the nutrition with the wealth status of the households, you see a quite sort of negative association with wealth and poverty, wealth and malnutrition. I have shown that for poverty earlier, and you see that obviously with economic growth, the stunting level declines. But we don't see much of a relationship with wasting. The relationship is very, very weak in that. So the nutrition issue is not only the issue of the poor people. They are also issue for the relatively better off situation and the better off households in the country. So this is an issue of not just economic progress, but of behavior change and others regarding care and feeding of the children. Now, the final one on the water, sanitation, and hygiene. If you look at the water situation, actually the access to safe drinking water was quite high in Bangladesh because of the spread of tubewell irrigation earlier. Almost over 80% of the people have access to safe drinking water. But recently there has been some relapse, and this is because of arsenic contamination of water. Many people blame highly irrigated agriculture partly to this because the irrigation has come from the exploitation of groundwater through shallow tube wells, and the arsenic remains in the upper aquifer. So with tube well irrigation, the drinking water wells get contaminated with arsenic. The soil, the arsenic is deposited in the soil, and there are concerns whether the food is contaminated by arsenic also. And you see the situation is worse in the rural areas than in the urban areas. So that shows an indication of the agriculture's negative effect on the quality of water. On the this was about the drinking water, but the other water uses like cooking and bathing, we still have a lot to achieve. If you look at the numbers, it's about 60% of the households use tube well water for the other sort of non-drinking purposes. And this is almost the same irrespective of the income group. So this is another sort of area of concern regarding the water quality, particularly regarding the bathing water and the cooking water. Some people say that when you get river water and cook it, probably the germ is destroyed. But for bathing, obviously it creates the skin diseases and other issues if you don't use quality water. So the water issues, I think the major concern is now about arsenic contamination. About 13% of the household drink arsenic contaminated water beyond the permissible limit. And we see particularly in the middle part of the country, that's why the arsenic is, people say that it's a geological effect. The arsenic comes down with the water sources along the river and gets deposited in near the coast there. And this is the area which is the hot spot of the arsenic. And there we see a lot of health effects, particularly skin diseases and other things. But there are also social effects, like the villages where there is arsenic contamination and those skin diseases. It's very difficult for the people to get get their sons and daughters married with other areas. And there are some social studies which have demonstrated those sort of effect of arsenic on social effects. Regarding sanitation, I think the level is still very, very low, although there has been quite a bit of progress. We have about 28% of the households who have sanitary latrine, and another 16% who have paved pit latrine, which is also quite good. So if you combine those two together, nearly roughly about half of the household use the safe drinking levels, and there has been quite a big progress compared to 2000. So within 10 years we have made substantial progress there. This is the kacha latrine, which is not very very safe. But the most interesting story is the reduction of open defecation. There are about 23% of the household went for open defecation in 2000. It has now come down to 5.4%. So that's a big sort of substantial story. We haven't done any investigation on that, what contributed to this large reduction in open defecation. If we look at in the poverty scale about the use of sanitary latrine, we see that obviously the non-poor households have larger share of non-poor households use sanitary latrines, but there has been quite a big progress for the extreme poor and moderate poor. in having sort of better sanitary situation with the establishment of sanitary latrines in those households. So the progress has been much faster for the extreme poor and moderate poor households than the non-poor households with regard to access to good sanitation. This is I'm taking the story of reduction in open defecation by poverty scale. And you see that the reduction has been very rapid for the extreme poor households from 37% to only 10%. For the moderate poor from the 23% to 8%, and for the non-poor households from 12 to 3%. So there's still some sort of differentiation across the poverty scale, but the progress has been made for all groups of households there. Obviously, we are ultimately interested in illness when you talk about access to good, access to safe water and good sanitation and hygienic practices there. So the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics, they conducted regularly the household income and expenditure surveys, and they contain data on the morbidity level. And they define morbidity as people reporting illness over the last 1 month prior to the survey. The health professionals disagree somewhat on whether they should use 15 days or 1 month, but this is the information about 1 month. And the interesting thing is that the level of morbidity is quite high, and it doesn't vary too much across the income scale. So if you look at the non-poor households, the difference is not much. So one implication of that issue, that if you go for health interventions, it should be all households rather than just targeting the poor households, because the situation, both the morbidity is very high, and it's high for across all the socioeconomic and poverty groups. Particularly for this workshop, more interesting is the illness from diarrhea because of the water and sanitation. And there also we see quite substantial progress in the incidence of illness from diarrhea. And the progress has been made for all poverty groups. It's now about 3% of the children under 5. They have reported suffering from diarrhea. I must mention that this is a report rather than actual measurement. And since household income and expenditure survey collects a lot of information, obviously there would be non-sampling error and others. So the studies which now look at these issues, they should go for more accurate measurement, and maybe the incidence, they might find the incidence to be higher than that reported in the national statistics. So these are overall sort of situations, and I'm now going to BRAC's intervention in some of those areas. I should actually go faster. About BRAC, I don't know, many of you might be familiar. The organization now has over 100,000 employees, reaching an estimated 125 million people with an annual budget of US $900 million. About 600 million in Bangladesh and 300 million in 10 countries outside Bangladesh in which the organization is working. So it's now one of the largest non-governmental organizations, not only in Bangladesh it is the largest, but in the developing world this is one of the largest organizations. It was set up in 1972 as a relief and rehabilitation organization, but then it embarked on development issues and grew very, very fast. Since 2002, it has become an international NGO from the south, spreading its knowledge and experience of anti-poverty interventions to 10 other developing countries outside Bangladesh. So BRAC has a multifaceted development programs related to microfinance, ultra-poverty, agriculture, food security, education, health, disaster management, community empowerment, human rights and legal aid, and gender justice and diversity. So I'll give you a brief glance on 3 of the programs, one in agriculture, because we are interested in that, and the other is on water sanitation program, the WASH program, we are engaged in, as well as on the nutrition program. For agriculture, what we are now trying to do is to see whether we could reduce dependence on groundwater resources. So we are trying to develop shorter maturity rice varieties so that we have rainy season from mid-April to up to November, and whether we can grow 2 rice crops during the year. So that will put pressure, that will reduce the pressure on growth of dry season rice cultivation there, so that we can use the rain water for further increase in production. We are also doing farmer participated evaluation of climate resilience technologies, because the climate change is one of the severe development impediments in Bangladesh, and scientists have developed submergence tolerance, this is the flood tolerance rice, drought and salinity tolerant rice varieties. So we are engaged into farmer participated evaluation of those technologies for fast-tracking technology diffusion to farmers. We also engage in on-farm conservation of traditional rice, indigenous fish and medicinal plants, and we operate a seed system for supply of best quality seeds and diffusion of cutting-edge technologies, agricultural technologies. Recently, we are engaged into provision of credit and extension services for the poorer farmers. These are the marginal and tenant farmers of the country. They don't have any access to credit from the former financial institutions, so we are trying to see whether we could reach them on that. This is the rollout of the program. You see that we started it in 2010, and within 3 years, we have been able to organize about 17,000 tenant farmers association in different countries, with an enrollment of 355,000 members. But we are targeting more sort of women in recent years. You see, of the total numbers, almost 60% of the members who are accessing credit are women. We are also providing training, particularly targeting women, training on crop production and also on livestock and fishery, livestock cultivation, in which women are more heavily involved. Dr. Malik is now doing an impact assessment of that program using the randomized control experiments. On the nutrition, we have been engaged with the government on nutrition from early 1990s. We are part of, we had partnership with the government on Bangladesh Integrated Nutrition Program. Then we are also sort of engaged in partnership with the government on National Nutrition Services, but focusing mostly on behavior change of the mothers. Recently, we have a project called Alive and Thrive, which is basically focusing on compulsory breastfeeding for the first 6 months and complementary feedings from 6 months to 23 months. We have recently added the mothers, the pregnant mothers nutrition, in order to sort of have the package of the first 1,000 days concept of nutrition. So the messages that we are disseminating are breastfeeding immediately after birth of the child, feeding only breast milk up to 6 months, feeding mashed family food for children over 6 months, feeding animal source foods for children over 6 months, and cooking child's food with oil, and then add micronutrient powder, which contains many sort of nutrients, micronutrients, with the child's food. This is a recent initiative here. IFRI has recently done an evaluation of that project, and sort of following both the control as well as the intervention areas. And you see, this is a double difference measure of the impact, and many of the areas that they see very significant impact on the early initiation of breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding under 6 months. There has been quite significant change on that, but we don't have much sort of continued breastfeeding at 1 year, which is not supposed to be the case. Introduction of solid food, also the difference is not statistically significant. The other significant difference is minimal acceptable diet, but the level is very low. And the consumption of iron-rich food, the difference is significant, but we still have much to achieve in order to go for sort of universal level in that area. The other program that we have, which is very much relevant to this workshop, is the BRAC's Water Sanitation and Hygiene program. This is the WASH program. The first phase of this project operated in 150 out of 482 sub-districts in the country, so it's a very large kind of coverage. But recently 96 new sub-districts are included under the program. So we are now covering more than half of the country with the WASH program. The program is implemented in close collaboration with the government agencies. If you look at the program approaches, again, much of it is behavior change. We sort of engage in formation of village WASH committee for supporting behavior change education on the use of latrines and good hygienic practices. We train, we invest in training for capacity building of stakeholders, particularly those who produce water-sealed sanitation, water-sealed sanitary toilets. So we invest quite heavily on there and do supervision to see that they produce high-quality latrines. We establish deep wells in arsenic hotspots and also desalination plants in coastal areas to supply safe drinking water. The supply of safe drinking water in coastal areas is a big problem in the country. We also provide soft loans to poor households for installation of sanitary latrines, and we also engage in providing latrine for girls in secondary schools and promotion of sanitation and hygiene education. There again has been a study on the assessment of the impact done internally by the Research and Evaluation Division of BRAC. The study sort of covered 30,000 households for assessing sanitation coverage and water disease prevalence, and 6,000 households from 11 sub-districts to assess the water safety practices. We did a baseline, midline, and endline survey for doing the impact assessment. These are some of the results of that impact assessment. Some of the behavior change area, we suggest that the tube wells should be installed at a upper sort of elevated plane than the toilet in order to sort of reduce the risk of contamination. The tube wells should be have concrete build platform, and they should be cleaned regularly. The water supply, when you get water, it should be covered during the water transportation, and when you store water, the storage should also be covered. You look at the impact. The great impact has been on cleaning the platform of the tube wells, but there was some sort of impact. This is over a period of 4 years in other areas. But this is the area where we still have to do a lot of work on convincing the people to establish tube wells at an elevated plane. Ownership of sanitary latrines, it has gone up. In areas, as you might note that the coverage is higher than in the national on the sanitary latrines, and we see that the situation is quite satisfactory with regard to different poverty scales. The situation is almost the same. But the major problem remains in the use of hygienic practices, particularly hand washing. These are some of the critical sort of periods when the hand has to be washed before eating, after defecation, before feeding a child, after cleaning child feces, and before preparing food. These are the knowledge, so people know that these have to be done, but they have very little practice on that. So this is an indication that changing behavior, only this one, after cleaning child feces, we see quite some improvement, but the level is still lower than what should be the desirable level. So with regard to sanitation, there is a lot more to be desired, and the project did not make much impact in that area. On the water-related diseases, the study also collected information on that, and as I have mentioned, at the national level, we see in the intervention areas quite a big progress in reducing the water-related diseases. These are all the diseases with diarrhea, jaundice, and other kind of diseases. And if we look at the diseases, the prevalence of diarrhea, we see quite significant sort of reduction in the prevalence of diarrhea also in those areas. These are mostly, as I mentioned, mostly diarrhea, but some other water-related diseases are also there. So this is consistent with the national level sort of indication, and we see that the diarrheal incidence is higher among children under 5 compared to those children over 5 years of age. Okay, so thank you very much about the information. I think all we are trying to do is to nourish the child, nurture them, to say they become healthy individuals. Thank you.
I hope we have 15 minutes or so for discussion. Thank you for your presentation. Colleagues, we have recognized that this is a large and innovative and focused organization. They're probably bigger than all German NGOs combined.
Yeah, and if you have questions on the other aspects of BRAC, I'm available for.
Yeah, thank you. I think let me also draw a conclusion before we go into question and answer. The secret of success of BRAC, I think, was and is the integration of hard-hitting impact evaluations and research into everything what they do. And you yourself pioneered the first solid impact assessment of your sister organization, Grameen, the Grameen Microfinance Program. That's Mahabub Hossain's probably most quoted academic piece of research. So click it on. Your questions to Mahabub. Let me collect a few. Asefa, you go first. Go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Others here? Go ahead. Speak up so that they hear you on the video.
Maybe I should better start. Thank you very much for your exciting presentation. I just want to float a couple of questions in the interest of taking lessons. I came from Africa, and I'm particularly surprised with the kind of progress that Bangladesh is making, particularly in terms of the structural transformation from agriculture to services and manufacturing. Last week I was in a meeting in the Economic Commission for Africa, and the issue there was there has been growth in Africa, but this growth has not been inclusive, in the sense that there was a kind of a derailing in the process. What happens is, yes, there is a change, but the change is in the direction of informality, and where the service sector is growing, but the real sector is not growing. So what did Bangladesh did to maintain that kind of structure, structural transformation from agriculture to manufacturing? It has grown significantly. So what kind of development strategy did Bangladesh took to achieve that goal? My second question, if I'm allowed.
Sure.
BRAC is just a government. That's the way I look at it. $900 million annual budget. What's the source of
Funding.
money for BRAC?
Okay, the second.
Mahabub, let me just for the record say,
Yeah.
this was Dr. Asefa Atmassi,
Yeah.
head
I've heard his
of the
name.
Ethiopian Economic Association think tank. Go ahead.
They invited me to attend the conference that was held in Ethiopia, but I couldn't manage to go there. So I know him by name. The second one is easy. As I mentioned, that in Bangladesh we have this year actually it will be about $650 million budget, and out of that about 25% are donor dependent, because our programs in which we provide the services free of charge, those are education, health, nutrition, community empowerment, human rights and legal aid services. There we provide sort of services free of charge, and those are funded by by the donors, bilateral, mostly bilateral donors. We have, over the last 5 years, we have a core funding from GFID and OSAID. They gave us, for 5 years, roughly about $600 million support. So yearly we get about $130 million from these two organizations. But the others are self-supporting. The organization went for some what we call social enterprises. Now Professor Yunus is spreading that idea. But we have been practicing that for quite a long time, from 1978. Setting up social enterprises which will contribute to employment generation and poverty reduction. And there are quite a few number of those enterprises. That generates income. We invest half of that into our development program and half for expansion of those enterprises. And then the microfinance program, which is the largest program, is a self-sustaining program. We no longer depend on any donors on that, and that's a big chunk of the own resources that we depend on that. Now on the Bangladesh development strategy, one I would mention is obviously the population control. As I mentioned to you that our fertility level was more than 6 just 2.5 decades ago in the 1980s. Now it has come down to only 2.2 from that level, and the government made a special effort on that. So reducing the population pressure, now the growth rate is 1.2%. That released resources both at the household level as well as the national level. They don't have to spend too much on sort of food and other things at the household level. So that contributed to increase in investment ratio for the country. Now on economic sort of level, I think a big progress that has been done, but this is basically private sector, is on the garment industry. At independence, we have 75% of our export earnings came from jute industry. Now almost 80% of the revenue comes from the government, of the export earnings comes from the garment industry. And a few other industries are now growing, particularly pharmaceuticals is growing very fast on that. So there has been quite a good growth in industry. The share has gone up from only about 12% at the time of independence to now about 1/3, 32-33% of the industries, but very concentrated areas. This is one of our concerns, that we should go for more decentralized industrialization rather than depending on few. On services, the services were mostly informal earlier, but there are some formal services that has been spreading recently, particularly on financial institutions. Banking and other sectors have made very good progress in order to support the other sectors of the economy. So we have the productivity of the service sector has been growing because of the transfer from informal services to formal services.
One or two more quick questions we can, I think, afford. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My name is Tarango. Thank you for the clear and informative presentation. I just have 2 questions. In the BRAC WASH program, you said that you are giving soft loans for poor community members to construct their own latrines. And I would like to get a bit of elaboration on that, how it is working. Is it, I mean, improving the sanitation situation in the country at all, and if it will sustain in the long run? Is it a government strategy or is it the BRAC strategy alone? How do you see in general this strategy?
As I mentioned, that the government also has a program for expansion of the installation of sanitary latrines, and the government gives it free. But often there are problems of targeting. It's the better off households who get that rather than the poor households and all that. So in our WASH program, we specifically target, and the targeting is very rigorous, particularly the extreme poor households. And we give them not grants, sort of loans. They have to pay 50% of that, and 50% is basically grant over a period of time, just like in microfinance, that you pay small bit by bit, so they can afford to do that. And you have noted that in my Bangladesh story, there has been good progress in expansion of sanitary latrine for the extreme poor and poor households. And since we are covering almost half of the country, this is one impact that we have made. Someone was telling in the conference that in Bangladesh we have already saturated with the sanitary latrines. That's not the story. There's still a lot to sort of go for to reach the universal access to good sanitation.
Alicia has arrived.
Thank you very much for the presentation. In your
Alicia, if you step 2 steps forward, then the camera will see.
In your presentation, you referred to a very significant improvement in the reduction of open defecation, and you also referred to a BRAC study which looked at the drivers of this change. In that regard, I was wondering why this behavioral change was faster in that area and not as fast in the improvement of nutrition, especially surprisingly among the richer households.
I think this is an area where we need to go into detailed investigation, what sort of driven those processes. But one thing which is important is that because of the very intensive agricultural growth, I have mentioned that we now have lands in which 2 or even 3, even 4 crops are grown during the year. So you don't have any more open fields in the country. Even some of the orchards like bamboo orchards and others which are there have disappeared. So just physical access for open defecation has gone down, and obviously the awareness and all that, many of the NGOs working, they are focusing on those areas. These have also contributed to this kind of behavior change. But I think this is an area where we need to sort of go and do a detailed study of the factors.
Michael, that's interesting from BMZ.
Thank you. Your most interesting presentation raises even more questions. So I'm curious about what you showed in the beginning about persistent morbidity and malnourishment in the broader sense, various indicators, even for higher income, highest income levels. This is sort of counterintuitive. How would rather comparatively rich parents let their children stay hungry or malnourished? Can you explain?
Even the sort of care in terms of breastfeeding and others, you see the issue of compulsory breastfeeding, initiation of breastfeeding immediately after birth, and breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding up to 6 months. You see that is more prevalent among the poorer group than among the richer sort of households. Women in those households, they don't go for sort of breastfeeding after a few months. So this is an area, and as I mentioned, that we need to sort of target not just the poor, but all households in particular in those areas.
Hope, there was this catastrophic collapse of the building and the many death cases of many young women and men in the garment industry. And political debate here in Germany and elsewhere was, we must boycott this exploitative sector in Bangladesh and no longer buy our clothes from them. Should we do that, or should we happily wear the shirts ever after?
You should at least warn them, because what happens is that the entrepreneurs want to remain competitive at the world level, because there are so many other countries like Cambodia and Vietnam and others moving into that. So they would like to keep the wages low and invest less on safety measures and all that, and we see the result of that. But because of the hue and cry from the developed countries, not only Europe but also I think US, there has been some change. Now the government has installed inspection. They have given the Bangladesh Engineering University sort of inspection of the buildings, look at the safety standards. It's not just the collapse of the factory, but also arson and others, because there are many small sort of this kind of accidents happen where many people died because from the fire of the buildings and others. So some improvement has been taking place. I think the minimum wage, the government is putting pressure, so the minimum wage is also going up. But because of these pressures, I think it's good for the garment industry in Bangladesh. Although the entrepreneurs are also now looking at diversification of the market. They are moving to China and Japan. Europe was the major sort of market for the industry. So last year we thought that our export earnings from garments will go down because of those incidents. But the total export earnings increased by 16% last year, so because of the diversification of the markets.
What does BRAC know about the well-being of women in this new industry compared to well-being in rural areas where many of them come from?
I don't think that we have done some study. At one point, I think 10-15 years ago, we invested in buildings for accommodation of the girls from the garment industry, but we have stopped doing that because we don't see much of a demand, because obviously people would like to stay near their workplaces, so that's one of the problems there. But we are now sort of part of that monitoring mechanism of the garment industry that is also participating in that. But I think the economic empowerment obviously have increased as a result of employment in garment industry, although they don't earn much more than what they have been doing as domestic helpers earlier. But because of the independence, we see the age at marriage has been sort of delayed, and all that we found during the Industrial Revolution in Europe. So those things are happening. But in rural areas also, the women's empowerment has been growing because of the microfinance and other programs.
One of your most radical statements you made in passing, pointing at the distributional patterns of health and disease issues. You said we advocate not targeting, but comprehensive coverage. Would you elaborate on that for a moment? And what do your donors say about that? They all think very differently about that.
Donors always sort of go for obviously targeting, because the donors' resources are limited. Obviously they would like to see more impact on the welfare of the people and targeting there. But I think the government should go for a comprehensive program on that, because I just related it to the data that you have seen, that on morbidity and health related, we don't see much of a differentiation across the poverty scale.
Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Mahabub Hossain gave a presentation which exemplifies his style. Evidence-based, numbers-rich, facts-based, leaving research questions open. Mahabub, we thank you very much for coming and for educating us.
Thank you.